Yes, and I want to welcome everyone again, and I think we're going to begin just now. We have our panelists here and our co-sponsors, the League of Women Voters of Greenwich, and I'll turn it over to them, that is Chris, right now to begin with a nice introduction. Thank you, Chris.
Good afternoon. I'm Christine Lowe with the League of Women Voters of Greenwich. Thank you for joining us today. On behalf of the League of Women Voters in Greenwich Library, I'd like to welcome you to a webinar discussion with the registrars of voters for the town of Greenwich, Fred DeCaro and Mary Hegarty. Fred DeCaro was elected to the office of Registrar of Voters in 2008, and Mary Hegarty was elected in 2018. Together, they hold responsibility for maintaining accurate voter registration records, running the polling stations on election day, and maintaining free and fair elections in Greenwich. Today, they will help us understand important factors which the state and our town must consider when conducting elections during the 2020 coronavirus pandemic. Today's session will consist of a 45-minute presentation by Fred and Mary, followed by a 15-minute question and answer period. Audience questions can be submitted via the Q&A link throughout the presentation. Rick Hansen from the Greenwich Library and I will pose those questions from the audience to our panelists during the Q&A. Rick will provide the details now of how to participate and how to submit questions.
Thank you very much. And hi, everybody. My name is Rick Hansen. I'm your local history librarian at Greenwich Library. And please note, this webinar will be recorded and available for public view. Zoom may be new to some of you, and we're using the Zoom webinar format this afternoon rather than the typical Zoom meeting format. And this will allow us to better accommodate our great audience. So we will not see or hear you, and you will not see or hear each other. But take a moment, if you can, to explore your screen and the features of Zoom. And you will locate a Q&A section to submit questions. Just as Chris mentioned, we have reserved time at the end, at which point we will alternate reading submitted questions to our registrars. Thank you very much again to our registrars and the League of Women Voters of Greenwich. I will now turn it over to our registrars, Fred and Mary.
Mary, you're muted still.
Thank you, Fred. Good afternoon. Thank you, Rick and Chris, for the introduction. I am Mary Hegarty, Greenwich's Democratic Registrar of Voters, and with me, but somewhere out there, is my counterpart, Fred DeCaro, Greenwich's Republican Registrar of Voters. Thank you to the Greenwich Library and the League of Women Voters who have given us the opportunity to share something about voting during a pandemic. I'm in my first term as registrar, and I've learned enough to know that Fred, who has served as a registrar for more than a decade, is incredibly knowledgeable about all things election related. Connecticut's 169 municipalities each have a Democratic and a Republican registrar, which should help to give voters confidence that elections are run in a fair, bipartisan way. Registrars are elected every 2 years in even years, so Fred and I are up for re-election this year. We anticipate a hard-fought contest. Not really. If we both run as our respective parties' candidates, both of us will be re-elected. Fred and I run a Registrars of Voters office free from politics. We are both happy to help with voting-related matters and answer voting-related questions of Greenwich's residents without regard to their political persuasions. Greenwich is fortunate that we approach the job this way. Some towns in Connecticut have been known to have warring registrars. As Chris described, there are 3 things registrars of voters do. We keep the voter rolls up to date by registering new voters, which could be people new to town and people who will be turning 18 by election day, which this year is November 3rd. Take note, if you're 17, 17-year-olds who will turn 18 by November 3rd are also eligible to vote in the August 11 primary if they are registered in a party that is having a primary on August 11th. The third way that we keep Greenwich's voter rolls complete and accurate is we remove voters from the voting list who are no longer voting in Greenwich. What else do registrars do? We run elections. And now we run elections during a pandemic. The fact that we find ourselves in the midst of a health crisis does not change our overriding goal to run fair and safe elections. As people take gingerly steps navigating the COVID world, we all dream of getting back to our normal lives. I was reminded the other night while taking a recertification course as an election moderator that the greatest dramas of a pre-COVID election, a normal election in Greenwich, are just tiny blips compared to orchestrating an election in a pandemic. Yet I am confident there will be a primary on August 11th. There will be an election on November 3rd. Connecticut's voters will cast their ballots. Let's make casting our ballots, in spite of the difficulties posed by COVID, our collective expression of belief in our democracy. Casting our ballots is one way we can reclaim a piece of our normal lives. This afternoon, we will describe what voting in a pandemic will look like. So now I will turn it over to Fred, who will describe voting in Greenwich as we have known it.
Okay, thank you, Mary. So, as many of you know, Greenwich consists of 12 polling places. We have arranged it so voters always go to the same polling place, regardless of the election type. Polling places are all gyms or very large meeting rooms, which have fire code occupancies of 100 or more. This shows you where the 12 polling places are in Greenwich. And to give you an example of the kind of work that we do to plan out our polling places, we have schematics of every polling place. You could see for the vast majority of them, we use just a portion of the space. So as we move forward in the future, we believe we'll be able to continue to maintain social distancing if necessary. We also have election day registration, which is for individuals who have not registered prior to an election. This is only for elections. It is not for primaries or special elections. 1 out of 12 Greenwich residents votes by absentee ballot. Now that means that in the presidential election, we had about 4,000 absentee ballots. And before they come to us, they are all ably collected by the town clerk and her staff. And then on election day, they are passed over, and we have upwards of 20 poll workers opening and counting those absentee ballots. Over the past few years, we've really looked into what's going on with the absentee ballots, because we found that ballots routinely arrive late or they're rejected for failure to follow procedures. And it's important that we continue to educate voters about this. In 2018, we were forced to reject 39 absentee ballots because the instructions were not followed in terms of using the correct envelopes, signing, maintaining voter privacy, etc. In 2019, we had 63 ballots rejected simply because they were put in the mail by the voter too late. People need to understand that mail is no longer a one-day affair within the town. And we saw that especially in the 2020 special election, where even though it was just a portion of the town voting, we had 71 ballots rejected because they arrived late. That was a unique case because Martin Luther King Day was the day prior to the special election. So there was no mail delivery on that Monday, and of course, that's not just that there's no mail delivery, the post office wasn't working, so it shifted everything a day later. In our polling places, we usually have between 12 and 16 poll workers. They do everything from checking you in to handing you your ballots. If you've voted in Greenwich, We have notebook computers that also check you in by on the computer. And of course, our tabulator tender gives you your I voted sticker. So I'll let Mary talk a little bit more about what's happened in Connecticut since March.
I'm unmuted. Good. Thank you, Fred. So in Connecticut, the pandemic caused our presidential preference primary to be postponed twice. But unlike some states, Connecticut has not chosen to cancel the primary altogether. Several of the candidates who have withdrawn from the race on the Democratic side have still chosen to remain on the primary ballot in Connecticut. And the primary challenger to the Republican frontrunner also wants to remain on the ballot. Wisely, in my view, Connecticut's Secretary of the State and Governor Lamont have decided to hold the presidential preference primary on August 11th, when there already was a scheduled primary on the election calendar for state, district, and local offices on that date. A big question on voters' minds is, can I vote by absentee ballot for the August 11 primary and for the election on November 3rd? Pre-pandemic, voters in Connecticut could only vote by absentee ballot if they met one of 6 statutorily prescribed excuses. One of the excuses is the voter's illness. Connecticut's in the statute, it focuses on the voter's illness. Connecticut's state constitution language is broader. It allows for absentee voting, quote, because of sickness. So unlike Connecticut statute, the state constitution does not specify whose sickness. I'm sure legal minds in Hartford wrestled hard with the import of the statutory and the constitutional language. But key for voters who want to vote by absentee ballot, Governor Lamont issued Executive Order 7QQ on May 20th. 7QQ provides that in light of the COVID-19 virus, all eligible, and eligible in this context means the voters who are registered affiliated with the party, a party that's having a primary on August 11th. That means you're eligible to vote in the primary. So all eligible voters are allowed to vote by absentee for the August 11 primary. In that executive order, 7QQ, Governor Lamont, in effect, modified the Connecticut General Statute 9-135 to add to the 6 enumerated excuses permitting a voter to vote by absentee ballot. 7QQ states, an eligible voter may vote by absentee for the August 11, 2020 primary if he or she is unable to appear at his or her polling place during the hours of voting because of sickness of COVID-19. Echoing the language in Connecticut's Constitution, referring to sickness, not referring to who is sick. The Executive Order 7QQ goes on to say that a person shall be permitted to cast an absentee ballot if there is no federally approved and widely available vaccine for prevention of COVID-19. So bottom line, all eligible Connecticut voters can vote by absentee ballot for the August 11 primary. I'd like to give you some background on the legal authority for Governor Lamont's actions. On March 10th, Governor Lamont issued what is called a Declaration of Public Health and Civil Preparedness Emergencies. He did this as authorized by a Connecticut statute, section 28-9, and pursuant to this declaration of emergencies, Governor Lamont has issued executive orders which have either suspended or modified state statutes. This is what enabled the governor to issue Executive Order 7QQ, expanding the excuses for voting by absentee ballot for the August primary. However, the March 10th, declaration, which gives Governor Lamont the power to do this, expires on September 9th. So what does this mean for the November 3rd election? More on this in a moment. First, Fred will fill us in on what other states have been doing.
Okay. Thank you, Mary. So I'm going to give us a little tour of some of the states that have held primaries or are about to hold primaries. There's a lot of quotes, a lot of data in the rest of this. The presentation will be posted on the Town of Greenwich website on the Registrar of Voters page. And every quotation and every bit of data, you will find a link to it in the speaker notes when you take a look at that. So I want to start with Wisconsin. So Wisconsin did not postpone their primary. Wisconsin is a state that offers no excuse absentee ballots and polling places. And they should, as the Center for American Progress stated, had a reasonably well-prepared situation. What we found, however, was that there were a series of mishaps which caused problems throughout Wisconsin. So one of the first things was, if you look at these two maps that I have here, on the left-hand side are all of the polling places which were open in 2016. And on the right-hand side are all of the polling places that were open in 2020. You'll notice that in the city of Milwaukee, there were only 5 polling places open. Typically, there are 180 polling places. Part of that was because the city decided, because of the influx of absentee ballots, to close polling places. But another large part of that was a fear of poll workers to actually work at the polls, which led to so many of those closing down. In Wisconsin, they had, as I said, a no excuse absentee ballot system, but it was really stretched to the breaking point. This is an article from, I believe it's the New York Times, and 3 tubs of absentee ballots never reached voters. 9,000 requests were never sent, and others recorded as sent were never received. Very important, obviously, that if you are moving and shifting systems quickly, you have the infrastructure in place. So Ohio was an interesting case because they did move their primary from April 17th to, March 17th to April 28th. And they took a different tack. They required almost everyone to vote by mail. The only folks that had a legal need, such as a disability that didn't allow them to vote by a paper ballot, were allowed to vote in person. And they mailed every voter a postcard that explained how to apply for an absentee ballot. So turnout was much lower by the time of the Ohio primary because many of the candidates had dropped out. However, similarly, the infrastructure was stretched. And as pointed out by both the League of Women Voters and Common Cause Ohio, there were many voters who didn't receive their ballots. Ohio had similar problems to Wisconsin. And again, because voting by mail was very new, millions of voters who have never previously voted were attempting to do so and growing frustrated when it didn't go smoothly. So these are important lessons for us as we tackle the same issues here in Connecticut. So New York is the next place that we can look at. Their primary is coming up in just a few weeks. And they are going to have their polling places open. But in addition, they are sending out absentee ballot applications to all eligible voters who are in active or inactive status. Now, I put this in red because it was a little surprising to both Mary and I know we have some fellow registrars on the call. Inactive voters are typically voters that we've been able to demonstrate no longer live at their address. For instance, we have 4,000 inactive voters in Greenwich. to send out 4,000 applications to folks who we're pretty sure doesn't live there seems like something that we'd want to consider long and hard. And that is not the way Connecticut is handling it. Connecticut is only sending applications to active voters. They also have a cutoff for sending back the application. So Connecticut doesn't have a specific cutoff date written in the statute. There are obviously practicalities. If you send in an application, it's very difficult for it to get back and forth. And they are maintaining early voting. So, New York is a place for us to watch, as they will be roughly 2 months before we have our primary. Mary, I believe this is to you now on what Connecticut is considering.
Yes. So I'm going to pick up where I left off, which is back to the big election on November 3rd. As I mentioned earlier, Governor Lamont has the power to issue executive orders related to COVID-19, but his power expires on September 9th unless it's extended. If an extension happens, Governor Lamont could issue another executive order that would be similar to Executive Order QQ, which expanded what is a valid excuse for voting by absentee ballot, and he could do that for the November election. But if there is no extension of his special emergency powers, what other ways can Connecticut address voters' concerns about voting safely in November? What I've heard is that there may be a special session of the state legislature called to expand the use of absentee ballots in November, among other things. We'll need to stay tuned on this. In any event, the voting landscape in Connecticut and across the country is changing almost daily. 2 weeks ago, the rules on who could vote by absentee ballot in Connecticut were confusing at best. Now we have clarity on this issue for August. But will voters embrace these changes? My prediction is that many voters will choose to vote by absentee ballot. But others, proud of Connecticut's sobriquet, the land of steady habits, will determinedly vote at the polls. Some will be motivated by distrust of the new or distrust of the males. Others look forward to voting at their polling place despite possible perils. Importantly, federal and state law provides for accessible voting at the polls for disabled voters. So our goal as registrars in this unprecedented time is to implement changes that will make voting accessible and safe for all voters and all poll workers, whether votes are cast by absentee ballot or by voting at the polls. Fred will now discuss what municipalities need to consider in running an election during this pandemic.
Sure. Well, as expected, polling places need to be laid out for social distancing. And as I mentioned earlier, we have the space in all of our polling places to accommodate that. We are obviously very concerned about protecting both voters and our poll workers. And we're doing everything we can to make certain we have enough equipment for everyone, going so far as to measure how many, Mary actually helped us measure how many squirts of hand sanitizer there are in a 12-ounce bottle. You'll be happy to know it's 250. Typically at an election, we have privacy folders, which allow a voter to have their ballot and carry it around without folks seeing how they voted. We are going to, while the law says you must offer them, we're going to effectively dispense with them because this is a single-sided ballot and folks can simply turn it upside down. We're providing golf pencils for single use or suggesting voters bring your own pen, and Mary will talk more about some of these. We're supplying both surgical and KN95 masks for poll workers. They can choose which one they're most comfortable with. We also have face shields and gloves, and unfortunately we will be, for this primary, doing away with the coveted I voted sticker. I mentioned before that our polling places typically have between 12 and 16 poll workers. In the primary, which is actually running two lines, one for Republicans, one for Democrats, we will be sharing as much as possible poll workers, and we will only have 5 folks, one of whom is dedicated specifically to cleaning. So this is obviously not sustainable for a significant turnout. We will have to have many more poll workers, but for now, as the curve descends, hopefully without any recurrence, we're doing this on a very small scale of staff. You will also see that we'll be using plexiglass shields in addition, in order to create additional sneeze and droplet barriers. And we're very fortunate, actually. So many towns have been moving towards these 4-person voting systems on the left, privacy booths. And we have maintained these single privacy booths that can be spread out much more easily. And I want to thank those towns that were getting rid of those, because I did a little road trip earlier in the year and picked up a whole bunch of them for free. And no, folks, you can't have them back, but maybe after November we can negotiate a little bit more about that. We also are looking into very unique cases, but things that have been issues for registrars in the past. For instance, what happens if a voter says they can't medically tolerate a face covering? So we've spoken to the Secretary of State recently on this, and the staff attorney there told us that you do not refuse someone for that, and that's very similar to a case that went before the State Elections Enforcement Commission, where a gentleman who brought a child into a school which was undergoing asbestos abatement was asked to vote from his car. And he wanted to vote the exact same way as everyone else. And we will need to comply with that as well. So there are, as we mentioned, going to be an enormous number of absentee ballots relative to what usually happens at an election. Obviously for the primary, just because of the size of the turnout, there'll be fewer than the 2016 presidential election. And as I mentioned, there's no specific cutoff date for requesting an AB. We cannot open or count absentee ballots prior to 10 a.m. on election day. And that's because voters have the right to go to the polls if they are in town to change how they voted and pull their ballot. Connecticut currently has no rules about postmarks. It only states that absentee ballots must be in the town clerk's office by 8 p.m. And as I mentioned, there's no specific cutoff date for requesting that AB. So in in Greenwich, one of the things we're doing is obviously opening a lot of those ballots provides its own risks. We have purchased a machine similar to what we actually use in our office on a regular basis, which actually will automatically jog all of the incoming mail. So it goes to the bottom of the envelope. You turn it over, run it through, and it takes a very thin slice from it, so that all of those absentee ballots do not have to be manually opened by the poll workers. Although we are encouraging folks not to lick them when they seal them. You want to be as safe as possible. Mary, I believe that
Yes.
This is you again.
Yes, it is. So what can the voters expect for the August 11th primary? Fred has described some of the details, but I'm going to go into a little bit more about the absentee ballot procedures, because they will be different. For the primary and also for the general election, the Secretary of the State of Connecticut has described to the registrars of voters and the town clerks her plans for making absentee ballot voting more convenient for Connecticut's voters. For the primary and the general election, every registered voter in Connecticut, well, in the case of the primary, it will be every eligible registered voter, but for the November election, every registered voter in Connecticut will receive an absentee ballot application with a postage paid return envelope. Voters will mail their applications to their town clerk. The town clerk will process the applications into the state voter registration system. And then the absentee ballots will be mailed out to everyone who returns an application. Once again, return postage for mailing the completed ballots back to your town clerk will also be paid by the state. Alternatively, voters can deposit their ballots in an absentee ballot drop box. The Secretary of State is providing drop boxes for every town in Connecticut. Larger towns will get 2. Greenwich will have 2 drop boxes. The locations for the drop boxes will be determined by the town clerk. So voters who are not comfortable with the mail may choose to use this option. As we said before, the most important thing about the absentee ballot process is do not delay. Allow plenty of time for the back and forth. In Connecticut, your ballot must be received by the town clerk by election day. On election day, the town clerk will turn over the absentee ballots to the registrars of voters, and we will do the tallying. But as Fred mentioned, polls will also be open for voters who do not choose to vote by absentee ballot. What those polls will look like is not yet finalized. An important fact is that there's talk of possibly allowing for consolidated polling places, which of course would help with poll worker shortages in some places. To do this, another executive order from the governor would be required. And I mentioned, this is important because you need to be alert to the fact that if you do plan to vote in person, you may not be, it's possible you may not be voting in your normal polling place. Fred and I are working on plans to make in-person voting as safe as possible for voters and poll workers. We're gathering the equipment that Fred described, and including supplying the mini pencil. So we will not be using shared ballot markers. Maybe this is a good thing. Some voters may remember the big excitement of the 2019 municipal election in Greenwich when ballot markers dried up. So this is really a two-way street. What can voters do to make the process safer for all? We plan to publicize that we expect voters to wear masks and gloves. We will ask voters to bring clipboards or something to write against if they choose not to use a privacy booth to fill out their ballot. We will indicate that use of privacy folders is optional. We will carefully consider the layout of all polling places to support social distancing. In fact, our layout plans will be, they always are, and will for the primaries and election be reviewed by the town's fire marshal. And this time around, he will be looking at social distancing as one of the issues. We will create a safe space for tallying what we expect will be a significantly increased number of absentee ballots. In some ways, we're lucky we're having a primary in August because the August primary will help us to better prepare for the November election. And now Fred will discuss where voting in Connecticut is heading in 2021 and beyond.
Sure. So as the land of steady habits, Connecticut actually has the methods for voting, in particular in-person voting, written into their constitution, into our constitution. So a referendum was put before the citizens in 2014, and it was defeated 52-48. An upcoming referendum is already scheduled for 2021, which effectively is asking the same question with some changes to the language. And my guess is that with COVID on people's minds, that will probably pass. So how exactly does one transition to voting by mail? What are the pluses? What are the minuses? So opinions do differ on it. Many times folks think that there are sort of party affiliation issues related to that. However, on a nationwide basis, I've got two quotes here, one from Governor Cuomo and one from the Secretary of State in Georgia, one a Democrat, one a Republican, one with concerns about voting by mail, one who's entirely in favor of it. So, and I could just as easily have found quotes that go in the other direction. So there are numerous opinions related to this. But I will say that upon looking at the scholarship and upon looking at what has been done in other states, voting by mail can be fairly administered when it's done correctly. Now, how do you determine what exactly is correctly? Well, some of the folks who have put voting in place, or voting at home, or voting by mail in place, actually have created an association, the National Vote at Home Association, and put together a list of best practices, etc. And they also go on to say, what can you expect? What does voting by mail accomplish? And it has proven over and over that there's a significant cost savings when a state moves to all vote by mail and eliminates most of its local polling places. That's a key point. It obviously does provide protection in a situation like pandemics if the infrastructure allows, and there is a convenience for voters. What is not a feature of voting by mail, and this is a sort of a common misnomer related to it, is it does not in fact bring about higher turnout. During the first election, after voting by mail is introduced, there is a blip that brings the turnout up. But when that's studied over a period of time, that's determined to be a novelty effect. And after a couple of elections, turnout is exactly where it was in most of these states from before they went to vote by mail. Now, one thing that's really key related to moving forward related to this is, as said by the former Secretary of State from Oregon, which has had this for a while, is you cannot do this in a single election cycle. States have to create a comfort level for their voters. Election administrators have to make sure that concerns are being addressed and voters are educated. It is not something that is done until there's a critical mass of folks who are used to voting by mail. So the Vote at Home Association has shown the various steps that are necessary in order to move to that. Connecticut, you'll see here, is still at step one. Okay, so there are many things that need to happen before we can move to a safe and effective vote by mail implementation. They also rank these issues on a star basis. So Connecticut is ranked with 1 star, and we do not yet have no excuse absentee ballots. We do have pretty good data integrity, but we have none of the information and infrastructure necessary to verify signatures, to allow voters to cure errors with their ballots, or to track ballots. And tracking ballots is really key, because once that ballot leaves the town clerk's office or a service bureau, if they help to mail it out, voters want to know it's been sent. They want to know when it's scheduled to arrive, and they want comfort that when they put it back, it has been received. So actually a leading proponent of vote by mail, MIT professor Charles Stewart, who's a real expert in the field, when he studied it in 2008, he said that the number of lost votes may have been as large as 7.6 million, approximately 1 in 5 individuals who attempted to vote by mail. Now that's 2008. So there's been things like intelligent barcodes that have been introduced since then, but all of these things need to be implemented in the individual state in order for us to get to a safe and effective system. Again, these are the gold standards as set forth by the Vote at Home Association. Right now, Connecticut only has one of those standards that we meet. And one of the other key pieces related to this is, besides the security aspects of it, which certainly we're asked about, is the voter experience has to be such that they're not, as what happened in Ohio, where everybody was required to vote by mail, has to be something that it doesn't lead to additional confusion. So what that means is that if you do have folks who, like we have right now, without these provisions, do have errors in returning their ballot, there should be a cure process during which they can come in, they're notified, that can be fixed. The ability to accept ballots that are postmarked on election day. Right now, they have to be received by election day. Typically, we don't include prepaid postage on envelopes. That's a key portion of improving the voter experience as put forth by this think tank. And you need to have many robust ballot return alternatives. The drop box that's mentioned, but also drive-through locations, ability for folks to go in what used to be polling places to drop these things off, etc. Building comfort with that process is absolutely key. And what's recommended is that you continue with your absentee ballot request process until roughly 50% of your voters are regularly requesting ballots by mail. At that point, you've educated voters related to how to use it. Hopefully, you have worked with communities that are very distrustful of the mail service. And as mentioned here, Colorado, in fact, who's now a leader in this, transitioned to vote by mail only after 2/3 of their voters requested to be, that should say, on a permanent absentee ballot list. We also need to reset our expectations because results are not available for several days after the election. So, coming with this, okay, is a new term and something which has not yet been standardized across the United States, and that is ballot harvesting. And I see we have a Q&A question that asks, can ballots be collected for submission? That depends on what state you're in. So in California, any person can go, and parties are now doing this as part of their own strategies, and they are picking up and collecting groups of ballots. That is illegal in other states. In North Carolina, individuals were prosecuted related to that last year. In Connecticut, it is also against the law. However, Arizona has a law similar to Connecticut. It has been challenged, and it is expected this entire concept is going to be going before the Supreme Court. Here in Connecticut, we had a situation in Bridgeport that Senator Marilyn Moore won the in-person vote against Joe Ganim in a primary last year for mayor of Bridgeport. However, she lost on the absentee ballots. And as indicated in this article, her campaign wrote letters to every voter that received an absentee ballot. Many of these letters were returned undeliverable, and yet these voters were checked off as having voted by absentee. And finally, one of the oddest situations that I've seen in terms of this is the state of Hawaii actually puts on their website the date when people can expect their ballot to be put in their mailbox. So this is something that I think we need to think long and hard about, because if there are bad actors who are interested in creating any sort of fraudulent situation, letting them know what day the ballot is to arrive in a mailbox is definitely something we should consider long and hard before implementing. Finally, this is Nevada this year. So Nevada chose to mail absentee ballots, not applications, but actually ballots, to both active and inactive voters. So as a result, these are pictures taken from outside apartment complexes where all of these folks who no longer live there and may not have lived there for up to 4 years, based on how long one stays on the inactive list, where their ballots were left and discarded by their current occupants of the location. Certainly something we want to be very careful about as we implement here in Connecticut, who you mail to and make sure our lists are clean. So I do want to say, Mary said to me, Fred, I know you've said about a lot of risks involved, but I do want to reiterate that I do believe that the process can be fairly administered, but it is not something to be rushed into. There are best practices that we need to follow, and we can really learn from what other states have done related to this. So Mary and I also wanted to touch very quickly on the other side of the coin, which is not what you do when you get your ballot, but what do you want to do in the midst of a virus situation if in fact you want to get on the ballot, you want to be elected. So this has really been an interesting situation because we have members of the parties who need to be nominated by their parties. And so what the parties are doing is they're having, just as we're doing today, Zoom conventions or using other tools. You can see that a virtual set of virtual conventions were held by the Connecticut Democrats, same thing by the Republicans, and the Republicans actually, you can actually see the conventions. They were streamed on YouTube. But what do you do if you're not a member of a major party and you're trying to get something on the ballot by petition, either yourself or an issue? So you still need to collect signatures. Now, the governor has reduced the number of signatures by 30%. So it used to be if you needed 5% of the members of your party to primary, you now need 3.5. If you want to seek direct access to the general ballot as a petition candidate, you used to need 1% of all votes cast. Now that's been reduced to 0.7%. In addition, for the first time, electronic signatures are allowed on petitions, but they're only allowed in a situation where it's one signature per petition. So if you are invited to sign a petition electronically, I put down here a couple of samples. You are not allowed to type your name in a signature looking font. That does not count. You actually have to try and use your mouse, okay, in order to, make a facsimile of your signature. And then only one signature per petition. Those would be collected from the candidate. In addition, there are typically requirements on the back side of the petition that have to be signed and then either notarized or brought before the town clerk, stating the authenticity of the signatures. Given that there's only one per sheet during this process, that has been dispensed with. So that concludes our presentation. This is contact information for Mary and I, as well as the Secretary of State. We will be taking questions now, and everything that you've seen up here, including the speaker notes and links to all of the articles and data, et cetera, that were mentioned, will be available on our website shortly after this presentation.
Thank you very much, Fred and Mary. Very, very informative. And just as Fred mentioned, Chris and I will alternate looking at the Q&A submitted questions and read them to Fred and Mary to respond to. And Fred, I'd like to first ask a question about the Secretary of State and whether that person in Connecticut has the final word, or can Greenwich choose how to vote in certain procedures? And along those lines, does that include security measures?
So, Mary and I were actually talking about something recently related to this. And I said, typically, in my experience, when guidelines are issued, guidelines really mean requirements, and it's better to follow them than to truly consider them as guidelines. The Secretary of State does have quite expansive powers in terms of saying what we need to do. but it doesn't go so far as to the specific safety procedures, et cetera, within our polling places. But there are minimum standards in terms of the number of poll workers that you can have, how many privacy booths per the number of eligible voters, things like that.
And in this, for this, the upcoming primary and general election, the Secretary of State has asked registrars of every town in the state to supply the Secretary of State with their Safe Polls plan, which includes a number of elements. So everything is being, in effect, consolidated at the Secretary of State level, but I do feel the responsibility for running a safe election definitely still rests with the registrars. We're charged with gathering materials to run a safe election. There may be some help coming from the Secretary of the State, but that's uncertain at this point.
Okay. Could you talk a little bit about the, the timing for absentee ballots for both the primary and also for the general election? You know, when should you expect to submit an application for an absentee ballot? When should that come to you? When should you expect to mail it in? That whole sort of timing of that process, again, for both the primary and the general election.
Mary, I'll let you go ahead.
Okay, so we have heard that the Secretary of the State, who, as I described, will be sending a absentee ballot application to all voters in Connecticut. We have heard that those applications could be sent quite soon, in the month of June, I think. But things have changed or are changing daily, so I wouldn't rely on that. My strong advice, once again, is to respond to that application for absentee ballot promptly. There's no reason to delay. Although the ballots themselves will not be prepared until closer to the election day, the application itself it will go to the town clerk's office. They will enter into the system that you asked for a ballot, and then as soon as the ballots are available, you will be sent that ballot. And then once again, respond immediately, fill out your ballot, and send it in as soon as possible.
I would just add to that, because I see it's another one of the questions. You can submit your request for November now as well. So you obviously won't get the ballot until about 25 days before the November election, but anybody who knows they're going to be out of town or any of the reasons for that, again, at this point, we don't know that COVID is a legitimate reason, but for the remainder of the reasons, if you already have one of those, you could submit your ballot application now.
Fred and Mary, could you please talk about, excuse me, the mail-in applications, and should they always be sent through the USPS? Is there ever going to be something about fax, email? Will it always be a physical form?
So in the end, a wet signature is always required. So you can email an application to the town clerk, but then you have to be certain that you either immediately follow up with the original signed application being sent, or you need to include that with the absentee ballot when you get that and return it to the town clerk's office once you've voted. So at this point, a signature is always required. At some point, you can just delay handing in that signature if you need to expedite the process.
So here's a question. When you mail out an absentee ballot, how can you be sure that the person on the ballot, the person to whom the ballot is addressed, is voting and not someone else?
So the whole system doesn't, I mean, everything in our system involves a certain level of trust and the power of the affidavit that is involved throughout this. So when you complete your absentee ballot application and when you sign and seal your absentee ballot, there are affidavits on this saying that you are, submitting this, you are the person who's listed on it, and, you understand that you may be subject to penalties of perjury and a fine and possible imprisonment. The Secretary of State did say a couple of weeks ago, there are no absentee ballot police. And, there are, that is always a possibility. But that's one of the reasons why Mary and I are very diligent, as are other registrars, in making certain that we have very clean lists, checking annually via canvases, by sending out letters to voters using the National Change of Address system, et cetera, to make sure the right person is at that location.
And Mary and Fred, if somebody has submitted a request for an absentee ballot for the primary, could you please clarify if they need to do that for each election? That is the November election.
Yes, they do need to do that for each election. I think there is something, provision for applying for a permanent absentee ballot, but that is really to be used in the case of somebody who knows going forward they will not be able to vote at the polls.
Yes, if you go to our website, there is a section on permanent absentee ballots that does require a healthcare provider to certify your inability to go to the polls.
Okay, there's an assumption that many of the individuals who are working at the polls on election day are at high risk for COVID. Are you comfortable that you'll have an adequate number of people to work at the polls? Do you need more staff to work at the polls? Will that have an impact on throughput? And how do you apply to work there?
So it was very interesting to me. Before the primary was delayed, and we were really just in the beginning throes of the COVID virus, Fred and I sent out to our poll workers our question: are you available to work on April 28th, I believe the date was. And of the first 30 poll workers who responded, that was within the first 24 to 48 hours, 21 of them were over the age of 60. And of those 21, 13 of them were over the age of 70. So we have a pool of poll work, and we had included in our communication the information from the CDC describing the enhanced risk for older people of exposing themselves to, being out in the public. So that was interesting to me. I'm not concerned at all about the primary. I think we're going to have a very small number of poll workers, but for the general election, we need a large number of poll workers, and I think we'll learn more as we go along. Fred, maybe you could describe how, on our website, because you're up on that, how people could apply.
Sure. So I happen to have the website here.
Oh, great. Thank you. That's what I was hoping.
So you, in fact, can get to our website very easily at greenwichct.gov/vote. And we've worked hard to have plain language, sort of items on things you want to do. So I want to work on at the polls. If you click on that, there's a poll worker 101 that explains the process and the fact that it's a 14-hour day, et cetera. All of our training materials are published there, and we have a poll worker application if you are interested.
Fred and Mary, go ahead, Mary.
No, I was just going to say, well, Fred has the website up. There's on the opening page, we have the 25 things you can do online, which I think was a great addition to our website. And I mean, it was created by Fred for the, fact that town hall would not be open. But really, almost anything a resident wants to do related to voting can be done online.
Except actually voting.
That is true. Not yet. Not yet. That is in the future. Yeah.
Can voters who receive absentee ballots expect any part of that ballot to be filled out in advance? For instance, somebody submitted a question saying that in New York State, the temporary illness section was already checked.
So I think that they're referring to the absentee ballot application. And to our knowledge, there's nothing that will be pre-filled, but the coronavirus / COVID-19 will have been added to the applications that are being sent out to the Secretary of State as an available excuse on those forms that everybody will be receiving in June.
You mentioned that the governor's emergency powers extend through September, and those are the powers that enable this, the absentee ballots or the extension, the no excuse absentee ballot voting. At what point might we anticipate that we'll have a greater understanding of what might be, we'll be capable of, or what the absentee voting restrictions may or may not be in November?
Well, I think the first thing that will happen for us to keep our eye on is if the legislature is called to a special session, because if the legislature if they try to conform the statute a little bit better to what is stated in the state constitution, then I think that that would be allowing voting by absentee ballot in the middle of a pandemic. So I think the legislature is where we should focus in the near term. If that doesn't happen, then I think we're into the unknown. It's possible that Governor Lamont's special powers could be extended for a longer beyond September, through into the winter, but we'll just have to, we don't know at this point.
Mary and I don't know if we can eat a cheeseburger together at Wendy's, in September. So
Right.
Who knows, right?
And could you talk a little bit about reporting results and whether the timing of those results may be impacted? Could we expect the Secretary of State's Connecticut System Online to be revealing those results as they come in, and like they do in a typical standard?
Well, so I would expect for the primary and for the presidential election, because I don't think we're going to have moved, all this way, have taken all these steps, that we'll be reporting the same way that we do now. And you are required to have preliminary results in basically by midnight on the night of the election. But I do think that people do need to manage their expectations, because if we move to a full voting by mail system, people have can basically mail their ballots back, and they can be postmarked on election day. And typically additional days are necessary for that. And that also means that you no longer have the opportunity to go to the polling place on election day and withdraw your absentee ballot if you've decided to change, or you're back in town and you're voting in person now. But I don't think we foresee any issues for the next couple of elections. Again, also, as we know, in most cases, it's the press that's reporting the winner long before us anyway. We often don't know, because not all elections are close. And so statistically, there's a comfort level related to that. So it's really the close elections, I think, where it's going to make a difference.
Okay, just one more question then. I think Any opportunities for people in Greenwich to do early voting now?
If you, well, the absentee ballot is the form of early voting. So if you have one of those excuses, you're going to be out of town, for instance, you can go to the town clerk's office, fill out an application. They will generate the ballot for you right then and there, and you can vote it. So basically, we have 25 days of early voting, assuming you qualify for one of the excuses allowed in the Connecticut statutes.
And then I think we have a lot of great questions that came in, but the last question we'll have here before we'll sign off is asking about changing party affiliation as we near the primary in order to vote in the primary, and how might that be accomplished? And in your answer, I wonder if you could also advise people about following up with you in the coming days and weeks.
Sure. So I will throw a couple of plugs out there. The first is I see the question online, and the question specifically relates to an unaffiliated voter. And that's important because if you are changing between parties, for instance, if you are a Democrat and you want to vote in the Republican primary or vice versa, those party privileges require 3 months to be exchanged. So unless you already changed by May 11th, you cannot switch parties and vote in the primary. For an unaffiliated voter, however, they can choose up to the day before the election to choose a party. And they can do that by sending in a new voter registration card, or visiting us in our office, or they can do that online. So if you go to our website and you go to I want to become a voter, for instance, you will see there a link to online registration, register to vote online. That same process for registering online, okay, will also allow you to change, let me click these off real quickly. That'll also allow you to change your party, but it'll allow you to change your address. Okay, change your address or change your name right online. Okay, so, and again, I just want to point out that on our website, you can also, there's tools related to checking to see, are you already registered to vote? You can double check what primary you're in. We'll show you your polling place and a map of where it is relative to where you live. So we've got a lot of great information. And also, if you do vote by absentee ballot, it will display the status of, has your application been received? Has the ballot been issued by the town clerk? And has the ballot been received back by the town clerk? Those 3 statuses are available as we get closer to an election, again, using the same voter information lookup.
Go right ahead, Chris. I believe.
Yeah, I think that, yep, I know. I think that was most of the questions.
Wonderful. And Chris and I would like to say goodbye to everybody, and thank you very much again to Fred and Mary, our registrars, to the League of Women Voters of Greenwich for sponsoring this program, and all the help we've had from our great Greenwich Library. And please, again, follow up, just as you see on the screen there, if you have any more questions with your voting and preparedness this coming election cycle.
Okay, thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah.